Welcome to Nostalgic Medicine, a look back at the history of medicine and healthcare. In today's video, I'll attempt to figure out what killed Alexander the Great. He's among the most influential people ever in history. Alexander the Great inherited his father's relatively small Greek kingdom in 336 BC and conquered the mighty Persian Empire within a decade, taking control of territory stretching from Egypt to Pakistan and becoming the first ever European superpower. But just as he was preparing to launch an invasion into Arabia, Alexander the Great suddenly fell ill and died at the young age of 32 in the Palace of Babylon. His death has become one of the greatest ever unsolved medical mysteries. So in this video, we'll have a look at what possibly could have killed Alexander the Great. There's a small field of medicine called retrodiagnostics, where doctors and historians look back at mysterious deaths and medical phenomena of the past, and then try and explain what could have caused them. Examples of these include speculating about whether Jesus had a mental illness, or trying to determine which infectious organism was responsible for past pandemics like the Black Death. Retrospective diagnosis now come in the form of autopsies to figure out how people like George Floyd died. But in my opinion, the most fascinating case study of this field is the mysterious death of Alexander the Great, mainly because his early death massively impacted the course of history, and also because so many different theories exist about his death. I had to sift through dozens of studies which gave multiple opinions about what could have killed him, but we can largely divide most of the theories into three broad categories: alcohol-induced, tropical infectious disease, and deliberate poisoning. We'll evaluate each of these in this video, but first let's have a look at the symptoms that Alexander the Great suffered from before his death. Trying to come up with a reliable set of symptoms of his illness leaves us with some problems. The first problem is that the only surviving accounts of Alexander the Great comes from people writing hundreds of years after his death, who may have deliberately added things in or left things out due to personal and political reasons. The second problem is that the sources contradict each other about the symptoms of the Macedonian king. Regardless of that, by creating a blend of the different sources we have, the symptoms are as follows. In the year 323 BC, Alexander the Great was in the grand city of Babylon. He spent 2 days heavily drinking, first at a party, and then in the house of a soldier named Medius of Larissa, who was a close friend of the king. During the second day of drinking, he let out a sudden groan mid-drink as he had severe stabbing abdominal pain, and was helped away to bed. He woke up the next day feeling feverish, but was still able to carry out his duties. But over the next few days, the fever became worse, and he started to experience muscle weakness to the point that he could barely move, and was eventually unable to speak. He was only able to give orders by raising his hand or his head. Alexander the Great would eventually die on 11th of June 323 BC, 11 days after the party that started his illness. So to summarize, his symptoms was severe abdominal pain after heavy drinking, a progressively worsening fever, and then muscle weakness before dying over the course of 11 days. Several diseases could explain these symptoms, the first of which we'll look at are the ones caused by alcohol. The ancient historian Plutarch stated that Alexander the Great was not an alcoholic and only drank in moderation. However, there's a lot of evidence written about the life of Alexander the Great that contradicts this. An example is in 328 BC, when he became so drunk at a banquet that he dashed a javelin through the heart of one of his army officers after an argument. In fact, Alexander the Great held many of these banquets, and it wasn't uncommon for people to drink themselves to death at them, with one of his famous drinking contests killing 41 people after the winner of the contest drank around 13 litres of wine. Based on accounts of his 2-day drinking binge before his death, we can deduce that Alexander the Great drank 12 pints of wine in this time, which I calculated as being just over 75 units of alcohol, which is a ridiculous amount and could potentially be lethal. But Alexander most likely didn't die of an overdose, as his death was over a period of 11 days, whereas alcohol overdoses kill much more quickly than this, due to central nervous system depression causing a loss of drive to breathe. But we still can't completely rule out alcohol as a cause of his early demise. Excessive alcohol consumption can cause several acute problems, like a perforated stomach ulcer, acute pancreatitis, or a ruptured esophagus, which can all lead to a slow death. The symptoms of Alexander's illness most closely matches up with acute pancreatitis, which is caused by alcohol consumption 30% of the time. Pancreatitis first presents with severe abdominal pain and vomiting, which can then lead to a fever caused by intra-abdominal sepsis, and then death by multiple organ failure. To make things worse, Alexander the Great was reported to have drank even more wine during his illness to quench his thirst. The only symptom missing from accounts of his death is vomiting, but acute pancreatitis still seems like a good fit overall. But how does it hold up in comparisons to the other theories? The second theory about the cause of Alexander's death is an infectious disease. This one's much harder to prove, since Greek medicine during this time was based on the work of Hippocrates, who believed that diseases were caused by humours. There were also no effective treatments like antibiotics at the time, so it was incredibly common to die of an infection. Among the many different pathogens that have been proposed as causing his death, the 3 diseases that fit Alexander's symptoms the best are malaria, typhoid fever, and West Nile virus. In favour of an infectious disease cause, it just so happens that the king had a similar illness about 3 years before his death, which caused a high fever and eventually led to a coma. He survived that episode, but was a much weaker person this time round, due to the many stab wounds he had suffered from in recent battles. Malaria was an endemic disease throughout the ancient world, so was probably the most likely of these 3 to have infected him. In favour of the malaria hypothesis, Alexander the Great had recently sailed through a swamp nearby Babylon, which is a perfect breeding ground for malaria-transmitting mosquitoes. However, the classical intermittent fever curve of malaria is absent from accounts of his death. Typhoid fever is also a good fit. The Salmonella typhi bacteria largely resides in the gut, and can cause abdominal pain by perforating the intestinal wall, leading to fever and weakness. However, key symptoms of typhoid fever like diarrhea is missing from Alexander's illness. But the absence of certain symptoms shouldn't be a reason to completely dismiss either of these diseases. As we've seen from COVID-19, the variety of symptoms caused by SARS-CoV-2 varies from person to person. But it appears that West Nile fever has symptoms that perfectly match Alexander the Great's illness. It's caused by a virus that is transmitted by mosquitoes just like malaria, but it mainly affects only birds, but it does occasionally make a jump to humans, causing symptoms like fever, abdominal pain, and paralysis. To further support the theory of West Nile virus, it was said that upon entering Babylon, the Greek king observed several ravens dropping dead right in front of him. Unfortunately, West Nile virus was only discovered in 1937 in Africa, and genetic analysis of the virus showed that it's very unlikely that it existed in its current form back in 323 BC, so we can fairly confidently rule it out. In fact, the main problem with the infectious disease theory overall is that diseases like malaria and typhoid fever often affect multiple people at the same time in epidemics, but none of Alexander's soldiers were reported to have fallen ill with similar symptoms. So mysteriously, he was the only person affected, which brings us quite conveniently to our last theory. Alexander the Great had become paranoid and tyrannical in the year leading up to his death. His troops mutinied against him when he revealed his plans to invade India, and he was regularly purging army officials that he believed to be disloyal. Everyone around him had felt that Alexander had conquered more territory than they could ever dream of managing, but the Greek king was hell-bent on conquering more, so it was in the interest of both the Macedonian troops and his officials for Alexander to die. About a year after his death, a rumour started to spring up that Alexander the Great was poisoned. It was allegedly masterminded by Alexander's leading general Antipater, who might have feared that he was next in line to be purged by the king. Antipater's son was conveniently the cupbearer of Alexander the Great, so the rumour was that Antipater got his hand on a poison, which was specifically prepared by the great philosopher Aristotle, and then instructed his son to slip it into the king's drink. If that was the case, then it perfectly explains the sudden abdominal pain experienced by Alexander right after consuming his drink of wine, and assassinations were very common during this time. Alexander himself came into power after his father was assassinated by his bodyguard. So now that we've established that he could have been poisoned, we need to figure out what substance was actually used to poison him. A worthy candidate must have three characteristics. It must have been well known to the ancient Greeks at the time, it must accurately match the symptoms of Alexander's illness, and it must be fairly tasteless so that Alexander wouldn't notice the poison in his drink. The two most commonly suspected agents are the element arsenic and the alkaloid strychnine, both of which had already been known about for thousands of years by 323 BC, and were very frequently used to poison people. The problem with these two substances is that they mostly kill a person within a few hours, in contrary to Alexander the Great's slow death over 11 days. In fact, most poisons kill way too quickly to match his symptoms. But a poison that has recently been suggested is from the white hellebore plant, which was commonly used for medicinal purposes back in ancient Greece, but was also known to sometimes cause accidental poisoning. We now know that it causes acute abdominal pain with vomiting, followed by several days of hypotension and muscle weakness that would mimic Alexander's illness very well. The only problem with the white hellebore plant is that it isn't always lethal, so wouldn't necessarily be the best poison to use if Antipater wanted to guarantee that Alexander the Great died. On the other hand, a slow-acting substance could have reduced the suspicion of a poisoning, and he could have made his son administer multiple doses throughout the illness to ensure the king's death. But Alexander himself was never recorded as suspecting that he was poisoned, and several historians of the time like Plutarch adamantly dismissed the poisoning theory. So now that we've considered all of the theories, I'll give my personal opinion about what I think killed Alexander the Great. Well, as a doctor, if a patient presented to me with severe abdominal pain and a fever after drinking 72 units of alcohol, I'd be 90% sure that they were experiencing acute pancreatitis. But in medicine, we don't normally diagnose diseases based on just physical symptoms. I'd probably run a blood test or a CT scan to look for the signs of pancreatitis, then perhaps take some cultures to see if there's any infectious organism present in the blood, and then finally a toxicology report to detect the presence of any poisons. Of course, the doctors during the time of Alexander the Great didn't have access to this technology, so they could have never known for sure what actually caused his death. After the death of Alexander the Great, the Macedonian Empire fractured into pieces, proving that he was the glue holding everything together, so the entire course of history might be completely different if he survived. The last known resting place of his body was in the self-named Egyptian city of Alexandria, but unfortunately, despite many searches for his body, it's never actually been found. But just like how the cause of the Black Death was solved over 500 years after it occurred, there's still some hope that we might be able to solve his death. But unless we discover more reliable writings about the legendary king's death, or we somehow find a well-preserved body, the death of Alexander the Great will forever be a mystery.